So, when we think about climate change, we often picture the physical damage, the burning forests, the flooded streets, the homes swept away. But what we talk about far less is what it does to our minds. Extreme weather events don't just destroy buildings and ecosystems, they destabilize lives. They chip away at our sense of safety, our routine, and connection. Even if your home is still standing, your mental health might not be. For every one person physically injured by a natural disaster, 40 will experience psychological impacts. Even witnessing climate events online can take a toll on your mental health. But how does climate change affect those already living with mental illness? And what can be learned from their experiences? Hi, everyone. I'm Bea. Before doing my degree in psychology and neuroscience, I worked as a mental health support worker, and I saw how small changes could disrupt daily routine and could cause distress, how something like a heat wave wasn't just uncomfortable. It could lead to increased stress, exhaustion, deterioration in mental state. And the research backs this up. Research shows that climate change can exacerbate the symptoms of people living with mental illness. Some psychiatric medications, including those prescribed for people living with severe depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, can impair thermoregulation, meaning that the body can't effectively cool itself. With more frequent heat waves, this translates to an increased risk of heat stroke, hospitalization, and even death. And climate change has already contributed to an increased risk, an increase in suicide, with the figure projected to increase more than 5% by 2050. For my Wattle project, I wanted to create a resource, a handbook, to raise awareness about the heightened risks, most of which people didn't know about. And I wanted to share practical advice as to how to stay safe, how to prepare for high-risk days, how to support others. And importantly, I wanted this handbook to include the voices of people with lived experience. I imagined collecting stories that mirrored the science. Heat wave leads to mental health episode. A clear linear cause and effect. And outside of effectively solving the whole climate crisis, there were simple solutions I could present. Raise awareness about the risks and provide practical strategies to reduce the risk of harm, like raising awareness about resources people might not know about, like how some councils are increasing the amount of climate safe rooms that they have for people with complex healthcare needs, that their health conditions may worsen during heat waves and extreme cold. I understood the problem and I knew the solutions. But from the first few interviews that I did, the tidy narrative that I'd spun in my head began to unravel. What I heard wasn't simple and it wasn't neat. It wasn't linear. People didn't focus as much on how heat waves were impacting their mental well-being. They talked about the rising cost of living, fears surrounding unemployment, about the constant stream of environmental collapse on their screens, about fears of food insecurity and drinking microplastics. They talked about the mental health toll of trying to live with these issues while already managing their mental health. These were systemic issues that already disproportionately impacted people living with mental illness, all being magnified by climate change. And I had to admit to myself that I'd been looking at the problem with tunnel vision. I was prescribing a solution to a very specific problem and ignoring the broader, messier context, because these bigger issues weren't easily solved. At Wattle, we're encouraged to fall in love with the problem. But what if the problem is actually a tangle of 500 interconnected problems? It felt overwhelming and I had to come to terms with something. I didn't have all the answers and I couldn't approach the issue with a predefined set of solutions. But I could listen and I could ask and I could reflect. So I asked, how do you care for your mental health and well-being in the face of climate change? And the answers were pretty consistent. They weren't about marketed self-care or about how, something like a bubble bath makes you feel better. They talked about connection, about how being around others, hearing, sharing, and feeling understood helped their real fears feel more manageable. One of the interviewees that I interviewed with, who was living with bipolar disorder, described that mental health and self-care are so attached to money, but what happened to just sharing a meal, putting your phones aside and just talking? it's good to understand that in the face of climate change, you have to connect that one of the most powerful forms of climate resilience isn't about infrastructure or emergency plans. It's about connection, and it's about being heard, being understood, and being part of a community. And that's why I'm so grateful to have been a part of the Wattle community. Thank you.